Chapter 2, The Robot. "Maybe we can save the papers," Nancy burst out. She rushed up to one of the firemen and asked if he could possibly retrieve the luggage. He shook his head. "Not a chance of its being any good. But the fire is out. I'll ask the chief if you can go to your rooms." He called up to the balcony and repeated Nancy's request. The chief looked down. "It's safe enough now, but there's a lot of water damage." Mrs. Melody and the Drews hastened up the stairway. First they came to Mr. Drew's room. He looked inside and exclaimed, "My briefcase is gone!" "How terrible!" Nancy said. Mrs. Melody hurried along the balcony while Nancy stepped into her bedroom. Nothing seemed to be missing, but her suitcase was wide open. Every bit of clothing in it was soaked, as well as the dresses hanging in an alcove. "What a mess this is," she murmured. The next moment she heard Mrs. Melody coming back. In an excited voice, the woman said, "The papers concerning the property are missing. They must have been stolen." The fire chief looked at the three visitors quizzically, then called over a police inspector. "I suspected this incident was an incendiary act. Now these people say certain belongings of theirs have been stolen. There's no doubt in my mind but that the thief set the three blazes." The Drews exchanged questioning glances. A suspicion was forming in their minds. The inspector asked, "Have you folks any particular enemies?" "Not that we know of," Mr. Drew replied, "but the stolen papers related to a case on which I'm working." "My father is a lawyer," Nancy added. The inspector made no further inquiries, but he wrote down Mr. Drew's name and address in case he wanted to get in touch with him. After the firemen had left and the motel manager had assigned Nancy, her father, and Mrs. Melody to rooms in another section, the three went to the lobby and sat down to discuss what had happened. "I hate to say this," Mrs. Melody spoke up, "but I suspect Raleigh Banister was the one who stole the papers and set the fires." Nancy agreed, but her father pointed out, "There's a possibility it could have been a confederate of his." Mrs. Melody, suddenly realizing her nightclothes had been burned, said she wondered if any shops in the motel or in town might still be open. Nancy asked the desk clerk and learned that a small department store up the street did not close until 12. Since the most popular section of the shop was the soda counter, which was filled with young people, the Drews assumed that was the main reason for its being open late. The trio were able to purchase necessities to tide them over the night. In the morning, they could buy other articles. When they returned to the motel, Mrs. Melody said she was going to bed at once. Nancy asked her father to accompany her to the burned-out rooms. "Maybe we can pick up a clue," Nancy added. When they reached Mr. Drew's former room, they found a police detective at work there. He said he had located a number of fingerprints, but doubted that any of them belonged to the burglar. The Drews did not find a clue either in any of the rooms and walked onto the balcony. As Nancy stood out over the parking area, her foot touched something on the floor. Glancing down, she saw an unburned taper match in a crack and picked it up. Nancy showed the long match to her father. "I'll bet the man who set the fires used one of these." "It's a good guess." Nancy went on, "When we go to Raleigh Banister's house, I'll hunt for taper matches. If I find any like this one, it should be a pretty good proof that it was Raleigh who was here." She could hardly wait for the next day to come. Now that the Drews were directly involved in the mystery, Nancy was eager to start work. Although only 18, she had earned a reputation as an amateur detective by solving several cases, among them the secret of the old clock, the hidden staircase, and most recently, the mysterious mannequin. The following morning, when the Drews and Mrs. Melody arrived at Mrs. Carrier's home, they found her pale and nervous. Through a friend who was a newspaper reporter, she had heard of the fires at the motel and the theft of important papers. "I'm sure they were yours, and I'm terribly sorry. I know you must suspect, as I do, that the arsonist was my brother Raleigh. Oh, it's dreadful to have a member of one's family do disgraceful things." She looked pleadingly at Nancy and her father. "The police have no trace of Raleigh. Will you help me find him? I'm so worried that he's using an assumed name and cheating people out of money." Tears trickled down the woman's cheeks. Mrs. Melody put an arm around her old school friend. Please don't feel so bad about this. I'm sure your brother will be found and will make amends. Let's go out to his house and see if we can find something to help solve the mystery." They set out at once for Raleigh Banisters. When they reached the hilltop, the place seemed peaceful. In the bright sun, the house did not appear so formidable. Mrs. Carrier took the key from her handbag and inserted it into the front door lock. She turned the knob and the heavy door swung inward. The hall was dark, but daylight penetrated for a short distance. "Oh, what's that?" Mrs. Melody cried out, pulling back. All of them heard a strange whirring sound. The next instant, a weird metal figure whizzed across the hall, then went out of sight. But in a couple of moments, it returned and shot past the callers. "It's a robot!" Nancy exclaimed. "He must be guarding the place." The visitors hesitated to walk in, but presently the robot disappeared through a swinging door at the rear of the hallway. "I wonder if he's coming back," Mrs. Carrier said fearfully. "Raleigh didn't warn me that eerie things might happen here." Nancy was puzzled why the tape recorder at the door had not worked. Maybe the knocker sets it off. But when she rapped with it, there was no voice. "Strange," she murmured. Just then, the robot came through the swinging door. This time, the figure on wheels stopped beside a slanting column on top of which was a coach lamp. With one hand, the robot turned on the lamp. The funny little mechanical man then went toward the front door and snapped on the switch for a ceiling fixture. "Oh," Mrs. Carrier burst out, "I can't believe it." Mr. Drew smiled. "He seems harmless enough." Mrs. Melody pointed to a broad staircase. It was the most fantastic one any of them had ever seen. It twisted and turned every few feet. Even the spindles were not upright. Some slanted forward, others backward. On the left side, the railing ended in a very attractive newel. The other banister stopped about 3 steps from the floor and ran into a wall. The staircase had not been centered. The whole thing gave the entrance hallway an unbalanced look. "Why do you suppose your brother planned all this unusual architecture?" Mr. Drew asked Mrs. Carrier. "I haven't the faintest idea," she answered. As a little boy, Raleigh used to build queer-looking things with his blocks, and later with metal construction toys. He made buildings, bridges, and strange cars and planes. Mr. Drew nodded. "That figures. This place was sort of your brother's dream house." "I suppose so," Mrs. Carrier agreed. "He wanted to see how much he could build things off balance and without them toppling over." Nancy continued to stare at the crooked staircase. Smiling, she said, "Sliding down that banister would be a terrific challenge." "I certainly wouldn't want to attempt it," said Mrs. Melody. The walls of the entrance hall were papered in a gold and black floral pattern. There was only one picture. It hung just above the end of the unfinished banister and was a framed oriental hand-embroidered wall decoration. The visitors walked over to it and studied the weird design. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 serpents, Nancy counted, all intertwined. They look greedy and horrible. "Yes," her father said, "and each one is eating poisonous food. Some are flowers, others snakes. I recognize this plant as deadly nightshade." "And isn't one of the serpents swallowing a poisonous snake?" Nancy asked. "I think it's a cottonmouth." Before anyone could answer, the callers were startled by an explosion beyond the swinging door. "Oh, what happened?" Mrs. Melody exclaimed. The group stood frozen. If they rushed in to find out, would they perhaps be trapped and never get out of this weird house alive? End of Chapter 2.